Folks, I'm really excited here for our next speaker here at 6 o'clock. Our speaker is JP Nerbun. JP has joined us on the Intentionally Grounded podcast, one of our top listens from all of our shows that we had over the years. He's also the author here of Calling Up, a great book on leadership that I would really strongly encourage you guys to pick up if you really enjoy some of the information he's talking about. He's also the host of He's also the host of the Coaching Culture podcast. And I would highly, again, encourage you guys to subscribe to his work. I can't tell you how many times that I've gone to listen to that, and it's really found one or two pieces of things that have helped me in my coaching career and helping build those authentic relationships with our kids and helping us become transformational leaders. So guys, without any further ado, I give to you guys JP Nerbun.
And Brian, appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity to come on here and share with these coaches. It's appreciate you kind of giving a shout out there to the podcast and also my book, Calling Up. I'm kind of excited that this May I've got my second book coming out. I'll kind of talk a little bit about that today as well for all you guys listening. Let's see here, make sure I got the right screen I'm sharing to here. For all you listening though, you know, my job now, my career is in helping other coaches to build their team's culture, and kind of we'll talk a little bit about that because I think that's relevant to maybe some of the solutions that I'm going to be giving you today. So what I want to kind of share with all of you guys here as we kind of get going, because I think it's kind of relevant to Brian, some of your mission and your purpose for hosting this. And that comes around to the mental health of athletes and stuff. It's a great book that I would highly recommend to every coach, is What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, that came out last year. And there they go into some research, and they sum up some of the research they've had around the importance of community, which is related, I think, so much to connection and what we can create. And then there, Dr. Perry says, your connectedness to family, community, and culture is more predictive of your mental health than your history of adversity. And I think this is huge for us as coaches, because I think when we are coaching a world where the mental health of athletes and quite frankly, the mental health of coaches is struggling, right? There is a serious issues there. This, you know, a lot of times, you know, we might be having athletes that be struggling with their own mental health, their own challenges there. And it can be kind of overwhelming for us as a coach. You know, what do I need? Do I need to be a therapist here for these kids? And the reality is you don't need to be a therapist. You don't need to be some trained clinician here. You just need to show care, you know, concern. But also, like, one of the most powerful things you can do is to create a culture, a team culture, where they feel seen, known, and loved every day they walk in there, every day they walk into the gym or onto the field. You know, like when you create that, that can be healing in and of itself. That can be strengthening in and of itself. So whatever adversity that they face within their sport, because obviously sports provide a lot of adversity, but all the adversity they might be facing in their life, there's something really powerful in a team, you know, where they feel care, they feel connected to you and to the other players on your team and to the other coaches. So team culture is hugely important to the impact that sports can have on young people. Culture is kind of a buzzword, and I know some people get tired of it, but you know, the reality is it is the big driver of performance within a team. Obviously, you need talent, you need skill, but you need a strong culture, or else you'll always underperform. The way that I define culture and really measure it is through relationships and standards. So when we think about culture, you know, how strong are the relationships? How strong are the connections between people? And then when we look at the standards, it's the behaviors. How hard do people work here? You know, you might reflect on What's their attitude like? Those type of things. And so how high are those standards? And then how strong are those relationships? And the reality is you only will have standards that are so high if you don't have a relationship or strong relationships. So for example, if I want to challenge my players, my team to be better, there has to be a relationship of respect there for me as a coach. If I haven't built that relationship, then I can't really challenge them. I can't hold them accountable to a high standard, and vice versa. If you look at it, the relationship is only so meaningful if I hold them to a high standard. If I don't hold kids to a high standards, then there's really not a lot of meaning or significance to that relationship. So they kind of go hand in hand, and that's how we kind of look at culture, and that's what we're trying to raise. My newest book is called The Culture System, a proven process for creating an extraordinary team culture. It's coming out this May. And why a culture system? Well, obviously I go in depth to this idea of a culture system within the book. The big thing here is that you may have a vision or a philosophy towards coaching. You want to make a difference. You want to make an impact. You want kids to feel like you care. You want to challenge people, right? You have this view of what success looks like, this purpose, this reason why you coach, but you need an aligning system of strategies, methods, and tools to actually make that a reality. And so the culture system, while it is more of a simple way, a simpler way to make what sometimes might feel like it's incredibly difficult, but to make that executable, to drive the behavioral changes that you want, to build those relationships. And I've built the culture system that I've worked with coaches off of two really big things. And one of them is my study of, other extraordinary teams, as well as the research around, motivation and brain science. So I've studied all these extraordinary teams out there, the Patriots to UNC women's soccer to, Messiah soccer program to, UCLA basketball, right? All those things. You read all the leadership and culture books, and you study how other people have done that, and you start to see some common threads. And then the second thing that was the big learning thing for me was the teams that I've had the privilege of working with the last 5 years. So I've been fortunate to work with over 77 different coaches. I think it's 78, but in the last 5 years, it's been over 160 different teams in the last 5 years. I've been able to help those coaches to build their culture. And we've learned through those experiences, through some trial and error, we're refining. We've learned better ways of doing things. I won't say it's the best way. We're always looking for a better way, and it will always be evolving. But it is definitely better than when we were doing it 5 years ago, and it's better than when we were doing it a year ago. It's just constantly evolving this system for building culture. There's a great little story out there about the Messiah soccer team. If you ever have a chance to pick up the Messiah method, it's a phenomenal book. They're a Division III soccer program that's won an incredible amount of national championships up in Pennsylvania the last few years. And there's a really powerful quote in the book from the author Michael Zigarelli, who studied them. And he says, when it comes to building the culture, he talks about these 7 different disciplines that they did, like strategies for culture building. He says to orchestrate any one of them with consistency requires effort and expertise. To orchestrate all of them requires a master conductor. That's kind of like, I've interviewed Zigarelli. I've interviewed the coaches, Coach Brandt from, who's the former Messiah soccer coach. And I've asked them about this, and it's incredibly insightful into the challenges that it is for all of us as coaches to actually build culture. And so we're trying to simplify them. But, one of the other things is, as I've read Zigarelli's book and I've studied all these others, is I realize that all these exceptional team cultures, they all whether it's Messiah or it's even like a Navy ship captain. I got to interview Michael Abrashoff, the author of It's Your Ship. Southwest Airlines, if you read Culture Code by Daniel Coyle, goes through loads of different teams there in business, and the Spurs, the Real Madrid, legacy about the All Blacks, the Cubs around the Chicago Cubs, Barcelona soccer, UCLA with John Wooden. In Upstream, Dan Heath talks about the systems that people use to build culture. Bill Walsh, Jim Collins in Good to Great, the story of the Highland rugby team out in Utah, Google, UNC women's soccer, loads of different teams within their captain system in the book, Captain's Class, the Patriots. I mean, you just look at all these different things, and I read quite a lot and I study quite a lot. All these teams do similar things and have a similar process. And I best express that process by, first off, you have a clear leadership philosophy. You have a strong leader that drives this, okay? And that's comes at the core of that process. And that's the transformational leader. Now, that process actually looks like you're continuously establishing, supporting, and enforcing the culture. It's a continuous process. And when you break that down to the main core strategies, it looks like this. And you have to apologize for this very raw graphic. I'm in the middle of updating some of my graphics here in the next month for my new book coming out here. But I just wanted to, it's a simple way to express the main core strategies that we work with coaches on to build the culture, to establish it, to support it, to enforce it. Remember that establishing relationships and standards, that's supporting the relationships and standards, and that's enforcing those standards and reinforcing those relationships. So today, I just want to share with you guys, a few quick strategies here over the next 15 minutes, potentially, maybe not even 15, next 10 minutes here. Just as far as when it comes to enforcing standards. And the reason I want to do that is because I think this is a simple way that every coach can get better. You can do things better. Now, to maximize the effectiveness, you need to have established standards and supported standards before you just jump in right now and start becoming the accountability guy. But hopefully you'll be able to substitute some of the current ways you're doing things with some better ways here that I'm going to outline today. When it comes to enforcing standards, the traditional way of discipline or accountability is punishments on one end, and then a little bit of permissiveness on the other. We all struggle with both as a coach. Some struggle more with permissiveness. Some struggle more with constantly using those punishment type approaches. When I think about punishment, we think about blaming, shaming, or yelling at our athletes. Or we think about like conditioning type punishments, penalty type stuff to get them. And we use those things to get them to do what we want them to do. Other times, the permissive coach might offer rewards or praise. Sometimes that praise is false. Sometimes it's authentic. It's true. It's true praise. But either way, we don't address the negative behaviors. We let it off the hook, and we just try to focus only on the good. And I'm all about. And if you saw it back on the enforcing, one of our core strategies is how we reinforce the behaviors. We catch them doing good. We have a cultural language to reinforce those behaviors in a positive way. But if that's all we do, then it will fall flat. Like, we need to enforce standards. We need accountability within our team. And a lot of people really struggle with that because we're uncomfortable with this old way of doing things, the blaming, the shaming, the yelling, the punishments. It doesn't feel good for us as a coach. It doesn't make sense because and I can give you a million reasons why we shouldn't yell at our athletes. One being that, it's not allowed in pretty much any other profession. But at the core, the number one reason why is because there's a better way of doing it, right? But I just think I for years didn't know what that was. But when we do it, and we do yell and scream, or we put them on a line and make them run when they're not working hard. When we do that, it does feel uncomfortable for us because we don't, it's not in line with our coaching purpose. There's some disconnect. And we don't want our players at the end of the day, even when we use those methods and they start working harder, is we don't want them to work hard, have a good attitude, be a good teammate because they're afraid of what will happen if they don't. We don't want them to work hard, have a good attitude because we told them that they needed to do it. We want them to work hard and have a good attitude because that's who they want to be, and because they know that those type of behaviors will lead to the experience that they want and the outcomes, the performance they want, right? We want them to work hard because they want to be a good player. You know, we want them to be respectful because they want to be a good teammate, because they want to be a good person. That's why we want to do them. So the more we use this traditional punishments and conditioning, the less of that we're going to get, the less of those intrinsic motivations we're going to get. So when coaches ask me, well, you know, when is it okay? When's it not okay? Like, am I saying it's absolutely the worst thing in the world to yell at an athlete or to make them use conditioning, you know, as punishment? No, it's not. You know, and well, when's it okay? You try to not use it as often as possible. You know, like every time I have to yell at my athletes there, I'm having to extrinsically motivate them. And it's the short term when it might be effective, but we're talking about the long term here. We're trying to talk about the big picture. And so that's why we want to avoid that, because we want to foster an environment that fuels that intrinsic motivation. When it comes to our approach, the different approach, which I call transformational discipline, it's respectful, related, revealed in advance, and it's reasonable. It's real in advance. It's part of the establishing standards. Hey, when we establish standards, okay, how are we going to hold you accountable to these type of things? So as often as possible, it's revealed in advance. It's related to the behavior. You know, conditioning as punishment when you're not working hard. Just in theory, think about it. I'm going to make you run because you're not working hard enough. Well, we're trying to teach our kids to run hard for the right reasons. It just sends this kind of mixed message. Like we want them to think conditioning is good for them, but here we're saying you're bad, you know, so I'm going to make you do running. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you really think about it. Yeah, is it effective? Yeah, short term, but we've all been there where like eventually, like, you know, our team doesn't respond to those things. So when we talk about transformational discipline, there's really three ways, and I'm going to give you an example on each of these ways here in a second here, but there's natural consequences, and then there's logical consequences, which I break into what are called progressive consequences and restorative consequences. So let's just talk about natural consequences. And I don't like a lot of information on slides, so I just threw these three words up here and I'm going to talk about them real quick for all of you guys to kind of better understand them. When it comes to natural consequences, one of the big things is a lot of times we save kids as parents, as coaches, from the natural consequences, instead of allowing them to experience the natural consequences of their behavior and then walking them through that experience to reflect and to learn from it. So for instance, I always give the example with coaches. You know, for years I yelled at my players. I offered rewards. You know, we did conditioning. If they didn't pick their jersey, you could put it in the wash machine when they finished practice. And it was this like constant battle to keep our locker room clean. Well, I fixed this problem when I just stopped saving them from the consequences. Well, the consequences are you don't get your jersey in the wash machine. You have a wet, cold, stinky jersey the next day. And so I just stopped picking those up, right? Stop putting them in the wash. And the next day when the player came in and they wanted a clean practice jersey, it's like, well, that's your practice jersey there. You didn't take care of it yourself. So now you have to wear a wet, cold jersey, right? So something simple of doing that. And it's like, oh, they learned pretty quick, you know, like I wasn't going to clean up their jersey anymore. And it wasn't an issue. So that's a simple way of a natural consequence. You know, early on and when you're coaching a team, there's a million different behaviors that you might want to correct. Let's say even just the first practice, you know, their effort is poor. The first time you organize it with your team, it might be okay to let them go through that experience of a poor effort and practice, a lack of discipline in the weight room. And then let's just say, it's some off-season stuff here and they're not working hard. Pull your team at the end, and bring them in as a group and just say, hey guys, all right, I want you all to just reflect on your effort today in the weight room. First off, how much better do you feel? How much stronger do you feel like you've gotten today? On a scale of 1 to 5, how great was your effort? Is that the type of player that you want to be? If you gave this effort consistently over time, would you be happy? You think you'll be happy with the results? Is this the type of team that we want to be, that we gave today, and in today's weight room session, whatever it is? But you're asking them to reflect on their behaviors and to how that feels, and does that align with their vision for themselves as a team and player? Is this the type of team that we want to be? And they'll probably most of the time be like, actually, no, this isn't. And so you're helping them to become more self-aware, rather than you come in there and be like, guys, this is the team we want to be. This isn't going to, just asking them to reflect in a calm manner on those things. So they're exploring the natural consequences of their behavior. Even there's some immediate effects. They don't usually feel good after that session. There's not that sense of having challenged myself and pushed myself. And, so just reviewing the natural consequences of their behavior helps to establish standards moving forward. Okay, so what should our standard now be in the weight room? For instance, another way to look at natural consequences that you might allow or tolerate, it might be something like around off-season commitment. This can be a challenging one, because I think a lot of times we really struggle with off-season commitment. For example, because we don't have a lot of control. And the reality is there's a big illusion of control that we have. Like, we don't really have a lot of control, period. We have even less control in the off season because we don't have games, right? So we can try to get really involved and, have rewards and punishment systems for player attendance and stuff like that, to weight sessions, to trainings, to practices in the off season. But at some point, you just got to say, all right, hey, this is what we're aspired for our off season to look like. If you don't want to be a part of that, come season, you're just not going to be the player you want to be. Maybe that player doesn't play as much, in the season. Maybe they don't even make the team. And that's that reflection. Well, okay, how did you prepare for this season? When they're not a starter, or when they're not, they don't make the team, or they're not, the all-star that they want to be. It's just to reflect. And so sometimes just some of those reflections take more time for things to build up. But it comes back to that whole, there's that quote, many of us have heard of it. Do your behaviors match your aspirations? And sometimes you got to give some players some space and not constantly be on them, but then after a month or 2 months or 3 months, ask them those questions, like, hey, the way that you've worked the last 3 months, is that in line with, is that going to get you where you want to go? Is that in line with who you want to be? So those are the natural consequences. There's a lot of different ways to let players experience those. And they can be very good learning experiences. When it comes to progressive consequences, they're kind of a logical consequence. Like, a logical consequence for a team would be, let's just say, a player still struggles to clean his locker, right? His locker is always a mess, or he's always leaving a mess there in the locker room, or the team might struggle. Well, they might lose their locker privilege, right? So having a locker is a privilege, and they're not entitled to it. And so they might have to just bring a gym bag in, every single day, and they don't get to use their locker, right? So that would be like a logical consequence, because it's related, it's respectful. It's like, well, hey, this is a privilege, you just lost it. But when we're usually talking about progressive consequences, there's two big areas. It's practices and games. And we want a progression, because at the far end of the spectrum is, if you don't have the right attitude or the right effort, if you don't live up to the standards of this team, is that at some point we might have to say you've lost the opportunity to be a part of this team. You lost the privilege of that. So it'd be removing the player from the team. That's the far end of the spectrum. We don't want to go there. usually as coaches, we allow behaviors, we tolerate behaviors, and then all of a sudden it's like, all right, I think we got to kick this kid off the team. When the reality is we've allowed and tolerated and accepted so many of these negative behaviors for so long. So when we talk about progressive consequences in practices, for instance, if there's poor effort in a drill or a little game within the practice, right? So let's just call it drill for any segment of practice. If the player's not working hard in that drill, or they have a really bad attitude and not being a great teammate, the first progression would be to have them do it again, to resetting the clock, to have them say, hey, just let's do that again. After that, and that may not always be appropriate, you may move to step 2, and that is to sit them out of the drill. To say, hey, you step off. All right, we'll see you in the next drill. You've lost the opportunity to get better. You've lost the privilege, of practicing in this drill. So it's just, you've lost that opportunity to get better. You sit them out of the drill. Now coaches go think, oh, well, that's exactly what they want because they're not working hard. Trust me, most guys, you sit them out of enough drills, they're going to be kind of embarrassed standing on the sideline a little bit, not embarrassed because you're shaming them. They're embarrassed because they recognize, well, first off, they want to be out there. They want to be getting better. And they're embarrassed because of their own behavior, not because you've shamed them. And you let them get back in the next drill. And oftentimes they will have self-corrected their behaviors after that. If they still struggle, then you say, you know what? Hey, JP, step off. And as soon as you're ready to start coming in and working hard, you let me know. And you can come back into practice. So that's the third level of that progression. The fourth level is I think you're done for the day, man. We'll you hang out there or on the sideline, or maybe it's go home, but we'll see you tomorrow. So you have that progression. You're not reaching, high levels of, get the heck out of here. We're not exploding on them. We're just like, hey, you've lost the opportunity to get better. We'll see you tomorrow. You do that enough, and you keep constantly having to do it with a certain player, then maybe you get to the point where that conversation comes up with, do you need to remove a player? But I haven't had a coach in my experience that's done the progressive consequences effectively that ever gets to that point. We just typically don't do a good job of the progressive consequences. But if you're doing those first 4 things really well, there's been very few instances where they have to remove the player. What usually happens is the player just self-selects and they just pull themselves off the team if it's really not a cultural fit. And that's fine, because you can't be for everyone if you want to be a special culture. When it comes to games, there's a progressive consequences, which is just, obviously to sub them out of the game. And once they've accepted the responsibility for their behavior, their effort or body language are poor, they go back in. The second progression in that is, let's say they haven't accepted their behavior as an issue, they haven't accepted responsibility, is they just remain on the sideline until they get what we would say above the line. They're meeting the cultural standard when it comes to their behavior there, with attitude, engagement, focus, and cheering on the other team. So they would just sit there until they're above the line there. Bar you still want them to go back in the game because of, they're a good player, their performance was solid. So you're waiting for them to be engaged in the sideline until they go back in. They don't go back in until they're back up above the line. So that would be the game consequence. And hopefully you wouldn't have to be sitting a guy the entire game. But, if they're not able to get back above the line, then they would sit, very few instances, had a few instances out there though, over the few years. I remember one with a Division I program I worked with, and the players, like the coaches, felt like it was becoming a distraction to have that player even on the sideline. Their negative energy was so bad. They were complaining, they were swearing. She said, hey, you know what? You've lost the privilege to be part of this team today. We'll just go to the locker room, get changed. And that was during a game. But that's very rare when you do all the other things right when it comes to establishing and supporting standards. And there's some other things I'm kind of leaving out here as far as support. You don't always just jump in and ask a kid to sit on a drill. You would typically have support of the standards and stuff like that, and other ways as well. I'm just kind of really covering this one element of enforcing. Lastly is the restorative. These are some of my favorite ways of doing things because they are so powerful. They're solutions-based consequences to fix the issue. And instead of like a punishment, and you might have to have a penalty, a suspension for certain behavioral stuff off the field or on the field or off the court, on the court. You might need a penalty of a suspension. That's fine, whatever, if the school requires it or your club requires it. But the restorative stuff is really where you see growth and impact on the players the way that we want. So restorative ones, when you think about it, when a player does something wrong, like there's a misbehavior, who does it affect? Well, first off, it affects them in a negative way, right? If they're late to practice, if they don't give great effort, all these type of behaviors, they negatively impact them and who they want to be and the outcomes they want. It also impacts the team in some ways, and in a negative way. If they're late, it's disruptive to practice. I mean, you get the idea, right? So it affects the team is the second way. And the third thing is it affects the relationship with you. And it might affect the relationship with another individual. So it's those relationships that it negatively impacts. It breaks trust, right? It's disrespectful, those type of things. So restorative address the issue. So if a player's late and I just run his butt into the ground for being late, does that actually really address the issue of the lack of like kind of trust or respect? If a player gets into a fight or he back talks an assistant coach, just running them, getting on them, does that really address the issue? Do I feel as the assistant coach, if I've been disrespected, do I now feel respected? Probably not. Does the player really learn from their experience? There's been a rupture in the relationship. There's been, between the player and the team and the player and the coach or another player. And so you have to fix that. So, some of my favorites, so, over the years, once we had a player forget his jersey in the soccer team and he showed up and he's like, "Coach, I forgot my jersey." They're on the road and doesn't realize the last minute. Well, what do you do? He's a starter. What do you do? And the coach just said, "Hey, you got to figure it out." So he actually talked to his team and said, "Guys, I forgot my jersey. Would any of the reserves be willing, that's probably not going to play, be willing to loan their jersey?" And one of the guys, stepped up, gave him his jersey, and the coach the next day sat down with him and said, "Okay, what can you do to make this right?" So he ends up like agreeing to kind of wash this guy's gear the rest of the season. That he borrowed his jersey from. It's just kind of like a way of, he could have obviously apologized to the team, but it was just kind of a cool way to invest in that relationship. I had a guy once late for the bus, and the coach just had that player. He had to be the first person at the bus the next time, and he had to bring donuts, right? Because the whole team had to wait for an extra 5 minutes for him. It's like, all right, well, next time you're bringing donuts. The next Saturday day, Saturday we're traveling. You're bringing it, and you're going to be here, 30 minutes early, and you'll help me out. Now, these restorative consequences sometimes are the idea of the coach, sometimes they're the idea of the player and the coach. Typically the coach would ask, "Hey, what do you think is a reasonable consequence? What do you think is a way that you can, make this up to your team or make this up to me," or, those type of things. We've had, two players get into a fight in practice. This is something that might happen often. So it's like, okay, hey, what do you think you guys can do as far as spending time together to kind of restore this relationship? And they might struggle with some ideas, but one of my favorites is just they're going to do a workout, an individual workout after practice, for 10 minutes the next week. So if practice finishes, the two of them go off, and then they're out there hanging out, spending time together on the field or on the court, getting some extra work in, pushing each other. That's a way of restoring the relationship. We've had other ones where, they have to eat lunch together for, every day during the rest of the next week, things like that. My last one is just, that I'd like to share is just it's definitely my favorite. It's a player quit mid-season on a team. He quit, and basketball team is back in around January. And Then he comes back in May and he's like, Coach, I want to come back out for the team this year. Now, lack of trust between him, the coach and this player and the team. Coach wanted to give this kid a second chance, but how do you do that and restore trust? Well, the team was head off to team camp first week of June. And we came with the idea that this guy would be the drinks guy. So when they go to the cafeteria, there's like 10, 15 guys on the team. He has to, get drinks for the rest of the people. So they sit down. This guy's got a tray of chocolate milk, some Cokes and drinks, and he's just delivering it to all the guys. The guys need refills. He's got to go do that. I mean, they just had fun with it. They were giving him a hard time. They'd be drinking their milk really fast. Just when he sat down, so that he had to get back up again, and they just gave him a hard time, but it was funny. It was fun. And like after 2 days, the point was made and trust had been reestablished, and he sucked it up, and they all had a good laugh about it. And the last day, I think the coach just said, hey, you're fine, you're good. The team had reconnected with that individual. So that's an example of the restorative consequences. So those are just new ways of approaching discipline, and I just wanted to share a few examples with all of you today. If you want to know more about me, you can head on over to tocculture.com. You can email me at jpnerbun@thriveonchallenge.com. That's my email. You can check out the Coaching Culture podcast. If you subscribe to the newsletter at tocculture.com, you'll get updates around my new book, which is coming out this May, the Culture System. So, yeah, I don't know if you got anything else. You said you had a few questions for me, Brian. So.
Yes, sir. So one of the themes and the questions that our listeners have I've had this about 2 or 3 times in different forms, but they talk about building a culture in an entire building. So, several of our, attendees here are high school coaches. And so they're obviously worried about impacting their own individual programs, but they're trying to find a way to connect the entire school or community in this new culture. So the first one comes from is, how do you build a culture in an entire building? And I think when they say building, I think they're talking about like a high school, for example.
Yeah, I think that's important that you're actually collaborating, working with the other stakeholders, that those key ones there. I think one of the big challenges that we find is that you're trying to build a culture within a culture, right? So there's a school community, let's just say, for instance, what's the culture within that school community? Sometimes it's in direct contradiction to the culture we might be creating. I have a coach that's really struggled over the last few years because the culture is all about winning. It's a very results-based culture within their sporting. So, nothing is good unless we win, which we also know is not true, right? You need talent, and sometimes you can win and your process might suck, right? So here, it's the wrong type of culture, and it's a bit of a fight. It's a bit of a challenge there. So obviously the first thing is, just you have to be doing the right things within your building, within your team, within your program first. But then it's about trying to build relationships with other people in there. And so one of the big things that I would want to do if I was a high school coach, for example, because I think that's probably a lot of the coaches that are listening, is I would early on, we do cultural health assessments. And so we reach out to our players, we reach out to the parents and our assistant coaches, and we ask them, their thoughts on the program, different types of feedback that we do. We try to get real 360. But I also would ask administrators and teachers, hey, what do you think of, if I'm the basketball coach, what do you think of the basketball program? What are your insights on that? And trying to collaborate with them. I want every teacher in that building to really understand my mission as a coach and the culture that I'm trying to create. And I want them to believe in that and to support me in that. Because if I got every teacher working with me on that, so first off, I'm going to reach out for feedback. And then I'm going to try to express in some way, through the way that I act, through the way that I talk about the program, like that I've got their back as teachers, right? And I hope that they'd have my back as a coach. So if they see issues, they'd let me know. So using the other teachers in your building is a real powerful way to leverage the community itself. The other thing is, I think as you're trying to explore better ways of doing things, is to be a cultural influencer yourself, right? Like if on our team, if the culture sucks, right? What do we want leaders to do? We want our players to step up and to challenge each other in a positive way, to call each other up. That's what we expect of our players. Well, that's what we need to expect of ourselves. So if the culture is all results driven, all right, what are some ways that you can start to engage others? I've seen coaches run book studies. I've seen coaches share podcasts of mine with other coaches out there and start kind of group discussions. I've come in and, I might have worked with a team, but I might have done a workshop for the entire athletic department one day, just to start to get people thinking differently about culture and about leadership. So you have to be kind of a bit of a cultural influencer in that way, and engage with them.
Perfect, Coach. And the next question I have, you kind of mentioned it a little bit when you're talking about your relationships piece of your presentation. So this kind of question will go along with that. They talked about how can you measure culture in your program? And I know you used the relationship piece to go on that, but again, I'll just ask that question, how you would measure culture in your program.
Yeah, I mean, I a really big thing about getting feedback consistently. We talk about 3 times a year at least, beginning of the year, kind of that off season, preseason time, hey, so because you might have had an off season. So, hey, what do you enjoy about this team so far? What don't you enjoy? And what's one thing you change if you could change it? Right. Those are 3 of the most simple questions that are broad and varied. There's a lot of different ways that we approach this with more detailed feedback from coaches. But we like to use Google Forms, with just a lot of our teams. Middle of the year, asking for feedback, getting people to reflect on it. Same thing. How do you think things are going with the team? How do you think I'm doing as a coach? And then at the end of the season, getting them to reflect and give feedback. Those are ways that we start to assess, the relationships and the behaviors there. I think everything's relative. So I think it's really hard because I think sometimes coaches come in and we've got this view of standards are up here and the reality is your team's here. And we've got to quickly assess, okay, this is where we're at. And just, there's a bit of accepting that this is where we're at and then just moving to the next step rather than constantly living this place of my team doesn't work hard or work, like that. It's just no, just this is where we're at. We're not totally accepting that this is where we're going to be tomorrow, but we're not going to hang up on this fact that this is where I think we should be every day. We're just constantly trying to move it and level up. And that would be a big thing. I mean, there's other ways to look at it too. Is just I like to have coaches have measures of success. The kids, which really focus on the kids' experience, the memories that they're having, the people they're becoming. And you could try to start to reflect on those things with players and interviews and exit interviews as well. But simplest way, just sending out some feedback forms. And those are my 3 favorite questions. What do you enjoy? What don't you enjoy? And what's one thing you'd change if you could change it?
And then the third question they have here, they're talking about, in this case, they're wanting to establish a leadership council or a leadership group. And you shared a lot of the books that you like in terms of helping, frame your mind on leadership. When it comes to them founding a leadership council, this coach asked, what would be a great way of selecting books for their leadership council? Because I think the coach is concerned that he's going to pick a book that sounds great to him, but maybe is above his kid's understanding. And so he wants to make sure he finds a appropriate book that would be impactful for the kids, but then also be something that they could enjoy. If that makes sense. What kind of process would you go about, establishing the book or choosing the book for the book study?
Yeah, well, I got a lot of thoughts on the leadership council because it's something that we've run for years and we're very intentional on how we use it within teams. And I've got an online course about that. The Captain's Council is what it's called. It's on my website as well. A lot of detailed ways to go about implementing that. The book study is one of the extra nice things to do with your leadership council. It's not foundational to an effective leadership council. If you want to develop leaders, you need to have them leading. You need to have them actually going out there and making decisions. That's what leadership is, and that's how they grow, and that's how they develop. Now, if you want to use a book to help supplement their development, I personally just can say I don't necessarily know. It depends on the age, the level, and all that stuff. There's obviously The Hard Hat by John Gordon and stuff like that. That's more, fable or simpler. But there's really impactful books of great substance that are maybe a little bit heavier, heavier reads. Well, my encouragement for coaches is, don't shy away from the bigger books, like something like a James Clear's Atomic Habits or The Captain's Class by Sam Walker. These books are heavier. You just have to move through them slower and with more intention. I think there's a lot more substance. I wrote a fable. Fable is my first book, so I'm not here to knock on fables, but there just is a different level of substance when you move beyond the fable. And I love that. Oh, it's readable, but like get something of a little bit more challenging for our youth here, and just move through it slowly, read it with them, ask them their thoughts on it. So my recommendation really for this coach is to focus on what are the leadership needs of your team. Is it their habits? Is it their, ability to be vulnerable and to be courageous? Is it their, lack of discipline? Is it the way that they challenge each other, the way they communicate is so ineffective, right? So think about that, and then find an appropriate book that matches up with the needs in the areas for growth.
Awesome. And the last question I got from one of the coaches is, when you're looking at, they have a question in terms of trauma, and they said it doesn't really matter what type of trauma your athlete would have gone through, but they said, what are some strategies that you would encourage coaches to use within your culture to deal with trauma?
Absolutely great one. And it kind of comes back to the very first quote I shared in this presentation, which is build a great culture, one where they feel seen, known, and loved. That's the biggest solution. When you do that, and I have another more practical thing, but like at the end of the day, when you build that culture, what actually happens, let's just say this individual has trauma and they go to therapy for an hour once a week to help work through that therapy. That's a strong dose of connection, possibly in that hour. But when you build a great team culture, there's hours and hours every week, and they get these doses just dripping of connection. And connection is so healing. This is what the research shows, is that the connection, the community is more impactful, right, than therapy, right? Therapy, by Dr. Bruce Perry, who I've interviewed twice in my podcast. He's the world's leading trauma psychiatrist. He's worked on Waco, Texas, and Columbine. He's the guy that they bring in to run the team to help people through these traumatic events. He says connection and community is more impactful and healing than therapy. Therapy is just a supplement to that. If you send someone is in therapy, but they don't have a connection, they don't have a community, there'll be no healing. So build the right community is the thing. And then you really need to be a coach that creates an environment that's controllable, it's predictable for those individuals. If I'm constantly as a coach up and down and losing my cool and I'm highly emotional, I'm further triggering their limbic system, their stress response system. I'm adding more stress that they don't need. They're already operating at a level where their stress is really high. And they probably might have a sensitized stress response system, which pretty much means that they're constantly experiencing stress, and they haven't been able to regulate themselves emotionally. So they come into practices, they come into games, they're already, really heightened, which is shortening their fuse. So that's why athletes become more explosive, more volatile. And they have these weird reactions, is because they have a very sensitized stress response system. So the more that I can act in a controllable and predictable way, the more I'm in control of my emotions as a coach, the more likely they're able to, be able to be in a place where they can regulate themselves. Perry always says, a dysregulated adult, which means like a highly emotional adult, will never help another individual regulate. So we can't help a player regulate their emotions if we don't regulate our own.